Are you COVID-19? Because you took my breath away. Whew. This is a good one. This is a good one, 8th grade. Feel free to use it. All right. Picking up with our lesson on the Industrial Revolution and how this changes the American landscape. So in the last video, I left off by talking about mass production and the system of interchangeable parts. I'm not going to go over what that was because you can look at the last video to learn that. But I do want to talk a little bit about the impact that mass production in the system of interchangeable parts had. Primarily, it made it much easier and cheaper for factories to manufacture products. The system of interchangeable parts lowers the cost of production. Right? And on the one hand, this allows these factories and the capitalists who invested in them to become fabulously wealthy. And it creates a wider gap between rich and poor than most people were comfortable with. However, there was a lot of benefit for the poor by the creation of the system of interchangeable parts. Number one, it created a lot more jobs in factories than were previously available, because as these capitalists became more and more wealthy, they didn't just like store up their money like Scrooge McDuck, right? They didn't have like gigantic rooms full of gold and cash. No, what they would do with their money is they would invest it in other factories being built, right? So the more these capitalists made money, the more money they pumped back into the economy, which meant more jobs were available. So that was actually very good for the poor. Another benefit of the system of interchangeable parts in mass production is as the cost of producing goods goes down, that meant the prices at which these goods were sold went down as well. So because of mass production in the system of interchangeable parts, even the poorest of the poor in America could afford basic necessities like clothing, for example. Before the system of interchangeable parts, clothing was expensive, right? If you were a poor person, you might own 1 or 2 shirts, 1 or 2 pairs of pants, and you'd be very, very lucky if you had any shoes at all. After the creation of the system of interchangeable parts, the cost of clothing and this goes way, way down, and the clothing supply goes way, way up. Right? So even the poor could afford to have shoes. This doesn't mean that all poor people were wearing shoes all the time, but it does mean that shoes became more affordable. And basically everyone was able to have a decent set of clothing. So they didn't have to wear the same dirty clothes every day. Now, I want to transition here to factory life. So factories relied on cheap labor. Remember, factories are all about producing as much as possible for the lowest cost possible. So they want to produce the most, the fastest, for the cheapest, right? And one of the inputs to the cost of a good in a factory is the cost of labor. So when you go to order an Apple product off of Amazon, the price of that product is determined by a variety of things, right? And I'm not going to go into all of it, but one of the things that determines the price of the product is how much did Apple or the manufacturers Apple is using have to pay the factory employees in Indonesia or in Bangladesh or in China to make the plastic that is used in the wrapper for this product, right? The cost of labor goes into determining the price of a good, right? And of course, what is the cheapest labor available to these factories? Well, this would be child labor. right? Child labor meant that factories would be willing to employ children as young as 7 years old, right? And you would not have to pay these children very much. These children would work in really unsafe conditions. The machines often took fingers, hands, feet, toes off of these kids. Um, these kids also had to work long hours, and they did not receive any education, right? Um, so factories exploited children. Child labor was a really, really big problem in the early stages of the American Industrial Revolution. Um, Also, because factories really only goal is to produce as many products as it can for the lowest cost possible. In addition to using child labor, it also meant that factory conditions were very terrible because factories didn't want to spend any unnecessary money making their factories more pleasant for their workers. Right? So a lot of workers were injured and killed in factories. Many workers also had to work between 12 and 15 hours every single day. Like, can you imagine going to a factory at 6 a.m. and not being done until 10 p.m.? Right? That was reality for some factory workers. Um, well, that'd be a 16-hour day, wouldn't it? Well, that's why I'm not a math teacher. All right, 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. There we go. That's better. Um, so one of the things that this led to was the labor movement in the United States. And one of the main efforts of the labor movement was to create powerful workers' unions. Right? So a union is a group of workers, um, usually headed by someone called a union boss, who negotiates with the capitalists to try to raise wages for the union workers, to improve working conditions, to limit the number of hours a day that the workers work, maybe to provide a longer lunch break, right? Things like this are things that unions did for workers. So unions at this time made the lives of workers significantly better than if they were just left at the mercy of the capitalist and the factory owner, right? So um, unions also began to use something called the strike to demand increased pay and better working conditions. So if the unions couldn't make a good deal with the factory owners, with the capitalists, the people who manage the factories, what the unions would do is they would tell all of their workers just not to show up to work. And while it's true that the workers would not get paid if they didn't show up to work, that would basically send the factories to a grinding halt, and it would cause the capitalists to panic, right? And oftentimes, what would happen is, in order to get the workers to be willing to go back to work, the owners of the factories would give in to the union's demands. Right? So the union would say, we need to raise all workers' pay by 5%, and we need to shorten the work day by 30 minutes. Right? And a capitalist would say, no way, we're not doing that. And then the union would say, fine, we're going to strike. Well, after a couple of days of the strike, and the capitalist isn't making any money and no one's working in the factories, the factory owners, the capitalists would freak out and they'd be like, all right, fine. We give in. Right? Or they would compromise and make a deal. So unions started to become very powerful. All right, let's talk about what's going on in the North. So in the 1800s, we had urbanization happening. And we talked about why that was in the last video. Remember, urbanization is the movement of large amounts of people from rural areas to urban areas. And industrialization is the main reason this happened. So urbanization happens because capitalists build these factories in cities, and agricultural workers would move to the cities to take these factory jobs instead of working on farms. The problem is these cities grew way too fast for their own good. Growing cities did not have the resources to accommodate the needs of their rapidly growing populations. Right? So streets became filthy. They were filled with garbage and waste. Right? People would just, do their business in a bucket and then dump it out on the street in front of their neighbor's house. right? And it wouldn't get picked up for like a week, right? Cities didn't have sewage systems, obviously, right? So whenever you don't have a sewage system, that means clean water is not available, and that also means disease will spread very, very rapidly. Um, Another big problem in cities was fires, because at this time, almost all buildings were constructed out of wood, and they were built very, very close together, right? When you have large structures built close together that are flammable, right? Fires could be common and they could spread very, very rapidly. Another problem that happened in the cities was the spread of slums, right? So slums are areas of cities where poor people live. Um, and the slums in these cities were overpopulated, meaning too many people were living in a small area. And slums are where diseases and fires and things like that were the most dangerous. All right. What else is happening? By the way, we're in chapter 7, section 2 now. I'm on slide 10. Uh, Technology, however, continues to benefit industry in the north. So even though living conditions and work conditions were not good, overall, American society is rapidly, rapidly advancing. And this is largely due to technological innovations. So there are several inventions that we're going to learn about. The first invention is the telegraph. The telegraph was invented by a guy named Samuel Morse. The telegraph is a device that allows messages to be sent over wires via coded electrical impulses. Right? So these wires could stretch for miles and miles and miles. So you could have a wire that stretches from New York to Philadelphia, right? And you would use something called the Morse code to send these electrical signals across these wires between the two cities. And so the person on the receiving end of the wire would translate the code into something called a telegraph, a telegram, and which is like a piece of paper where the code is translated, and the telegram would be hand delivered to the intended recipient of the message. Right? So why does this matter? Well, it expedited communication. It made it possible to send messages over long distances uh, in a period of hours rather than in a period of weeks. Right? So in the old days, before the telegraph, if you wanted to send a message from New York to Philadelphia, it might take a week for that message to get there, depending on the weather and things like that. With the telegraph, the message would be sent from New York in the morning and it would reach Philadelphia by like the early afternoon, right? So this dramatically increased the rate at which business could be conducted and which government could function through communication, right? So it allowed people to send and quickly receive messages over long distances. Second invention occurs in the field of agriculture. There's an inventor named Cyrus McCormick who invented something called the thresher and the reaper. The thresher is a device, a machine that separates grains of wheat from the stalk. And the reaper is what actually cuts those stalks of wheat down. So you would go out in the field with a machine called a reaper. You would cut stalks of wheat down, and then the thresher would take the grain off of the stalk that you cut down. So these advances allowed farmers to rapidly grow and harvest a lot more wheat with fewer workers, right? So this dramatically increases food production and supply in the United States. And whenever you have a significant increase in supply and production, what does that mean? It means the cost is probably going to go down